Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen, and my guest today in episode 32 is Liam Pieper. Since the publication of his first non-fiction book in 2014, a memoir named the Feel-Good Hit of the Year, he has quickly followed it up with two more. Last year he published a collection of short essays called Mistakes Were Made, which I reviewed for the Weekend Australian, where I described his writing as electric, charged with meaning and energised by surprising comedic turns. With his third book, Liam has proved that he's supremely talented at writing fiction too. Named The Toymaker, his debut novel is based on an ambitious, multi-layered narrative that travels between an Australian business set in the present day and German concentration camps during World War II. The character that links these two worlds is a Russian Jew imprisoned during the war who escapes to Australia and starts a globally successful toy business. When Liam visited Brisbane in early August, I met him for the first time at his hotel room. Our conversation touches on the unique way in which Liam received funding to research and write The Toymaker while living overseas, how he navigated the legal threats that arose after the publication of his first book, which detailed his career as an adolescent drug dealer, how he messed up an important magazine assignment by filing 22,000 words instead of the requested length of 5,000 words, and how he helps young writers with finding the voice that best suits their style while working as content director for an online community called Writer's Block. Introducing Liam Pieper, author and freelance journalist. Liam Pieper, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
What are you doing in Brisbane?
I'm in Brisbane to promote my new novel, The Toymaker, which is somewhere between a fraught historical novel and a moral thriller in the style of modern contemporary social fiction. That's how I'm phrasing it when I'm forced to articulate what it's about on the fly, which I'm terrible at.
Yeah, those sound like rehearsed lines.
They do sound rehearsed, but I assure you I'm panicking. It's a very hard book to describe, I think, even though I wrote it. Although perhaps that makes it worse, because it is, a child of mine that gestated within me for the appointed length of time. And so it's a multitudinous hydrous thing with all these threads and thoughts attached to it that make trying to articulate what the story is about almost impossible. It isn't helped by the fact that it's quite a complicated story with a lot of twists and turns. Yes, which we'll come to. I finished it last night. I loved it. Thank you, that's very kind of you.
I love your non-fiction, and this is something else entirely, and you're a very good writer, Liam.
Thank you, that's kind. Some days I believe that, so most days I don't. But yeah, it was a risk, Fiction is something I love to read, and I used to write fiction less successfully when I was younger. So to move into fiction was something of a departure for me. A terrifying one, but maybe this has paid off. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'll start at the back, because at the acknowledgements you say the project was supported by the Prague UNESCO City of Literature in consultation with the Melbourne UNESCO City of Literature office. Mm-hmm. What the hell? What does that mean? How did that work?
Well, Melbourne, which is my hometown, is UNESCO City of Literature. UNESCO is United Nations Education, Science and Cultural Organisation.
Well remembered.
Thank you. And they are part of a network of cities who work together to, under the United Nations auspices, to promote culture. Melbourne was designated a City of Literature a few years ago, largely I think thanks to the Wheeler Centre, which serves as a hub for a lot of writing organisations down that way. And every few years, new cities are inducted into it, recently Prague was. And to celebrate, they were given money to just house a writer to write a book about Prague. And I had this idea kicking around and sketches, and I'd written much of it in a very rough form. And so I pitched it, and Melbourne, every city had to nominate a writer, and then Prague chose their writer. And Melbourne nominated me, and Prague chose that nomination, which I think surprised everybody. Because
what was the application process? Did you have to give like a writing sample, like a synopsis of the plot?
Yeah, just a small synopsis, a page, a letter of recommendation from David Writing, who is the head of City of Literature in Melbourne.
David Writing?
Writing.
Is that his name?
David Writing, like R-I-D-I-G.
Oh, I think you meant writing.
David Writing,
that would be
no.
Extraordinarily.
Yes.
Okay.
He should really just change it to that at this point. It would be a lot easier. And so they sent me over. You know, Prague was like, yes, we want the shitbag. Send us the most problematic person you can find.
That was the judge's comment. We want the shitbag.
I imagine that it was some sort of dare, like some sort of My Fair Lady-esque dare. Like, let's get the guy with the substance abuse problems that have been documented in his first book to go to the drug, alcohol, and partying capital of Central Europe, where a beer is cheaper than water and makes an adequate substitute for a hearty breakfast. The beer is delicious there.
What was that worth to you? That in a monetary sense?
In a monetary sense? The fiscal remuneration was generous. I think they gave me a stipend of about, I think it was €400 a month, which isn't a lot in Paris, but it is in Prague. And also my accommodation and flights were taken care of.
Right. So how long were you there?
I think it was 10 weeks all up.
Right. And your only job at that time was to work on the manuscript?
Yes, which is magnificent. I can't stress how important that was. That's the most rewarding reward that came with the whole thing is, you know, when as you no doubt know, when you're working on a longer project, it helps to be able to get a little bit weird, to isolate yourself from the concerns of making a living, of fiscal, financial, family responsibilities. I run out of alliteration. If you have fish, if you have pets, you don't have to look after them. Someone else is doing that. And so you're able to become utterly selfish and withdrawn and a little bit introspective and peculiar in a way that I find that I become in the late stages of a project when the characters are very much alive in my head and they've taken on a sort of autonomy, which sounds strange, you know, like a grown man talking about his imaginary friends taking on life of their own, but it's quite true. Like, and you know, while I finished this book, more or less in Prague, the bones of it, the kind of structure as I was working it out, happened on another residency. I was fortunate enough the year before that to go to India for 3 months, and just kind of work in the middle of nowhere with very spotty internet in an old Hindu liturgical dance temple. My residency in India was at a place called Nitragram, which means dance village. And it's an old Hindu liturgical dance academy. Kind of like the school from Fame, but for very devout Hindu dancers. And it's kind of where the best classical dancers in India go to really hone their chops, and they work really hard. The dance is, I never understood this about it, but like I love Bollywood films, just as a spectacle, you know. I just think they're fun, you know. I don't engage in them in any deep cultural level beyond the fact that they are spectacular. And But I didn't realize that a lot of the Indian dance that we see in those films, it's based on a long tradition of classical dance, and that is based on religious texts. Certain motions that people make. The dancers will dance in a certain way, and the way they disconnect their hips from their central torso when they dance, it all has meaning. It all has there's a vocabulary behind each action, so every dance tells a story. So I used to go down and watch these women dance every day, and they would rehearse from dawn all day and then put on performances at night. I've never seen anyone work that hard.
Wow.
And that was, it was a real kick in the tush, because it made me really appreciate how little time we have to work. There's something about this something about this Hindu work ethic really stuck in my Catholic guilt, and it really kind of fired me up to keep working. So I would just work and work and work all day. Plus there was no internet, which helped. Plus, again, meals were taken care of. We would eat with the dancers at lunchtime.
We?
Oh, sorry, we. There was this place was called Sangam House, which means convergence or confluence, where two rivers meet in Hindi. And writers from all over India come, and they take on a couple of gringos as well every year. So while I was there for 3 months, thanks to the auspices of Michelle Garneau, who is the Australian restaurateur who runs she runs M on the Bund in Shanghai, which is like a very kind of fancy bar and restaurant. But she also runs the Shanghai Literary Festival. She's a great reader, a great lover of books, and a philanthropist in that direction. So she I also applied for that. I've only ever won 2 things in my life, and they've both been magnificent residencies.
Yeah.
This book wouldn't exist without them.
Wow.
But again, yeah, a chance to dive really deep in oneself, quite isolated from the culture. I saw a lot and I did a lot, and I could travel a little bit within India, but, language, everyone speaks English there, in the major towns, but I was quite rural, and my Kannada, I believe is the language in the villages nearby, is not great. I'm not even sure if that's a language.
A dialect, maybe?
Yeah. And so, I was alone for a lot of the time, and that kind of loneliness can be astonishingly productive. So I'll be eternally grateful to both organisations, both the M folks and Michelle Garneau and David Writing of
yes.
Of the City of Literature.
Well, again, referring to the acknowledgements, starting at the end, you mentioned being sent to Berlin for the first time, where the idea for this novel took shape. So
yes.
The idea had been brewing for some time before you had the time to sit down and think about it.
Yes, I've never been asked this. I should learn that trick of just going to the acknowledgements and there's the backstory. One of the key inspirations behind this book was an ex-girlfriend of mine's family. They were survivors of the Holocaust, Russian Jews living in the southeast of Melbourne, where I grew up. And he was, particularly the grandfather, was a very kind of, the character of Arkady Kulikov.
Who is the central character of the Toymaker.
Mm-hmm. The most admirable parts of him are based on this man and men like him, kind of very stoic, very silent, older Eastern European gentlemen who had survived the Holocaust and been through unimaginable torment, and then moved to the other side of the world, to Australia, that at the time was quite anti-Semitic, that was, if not indifferent to their suffering, perhaps implicit in it by their silence, And I was I was struck by the incredible dignity of this man and those like him.
the way that he didn't complain or
Yes.
outwardly voice his feelings about how he was being treated, or had been treated.
Yes, precisely. And just the way he got on with life and was determined to make what he could of it and be as happy as he could. I remember he was, in a very stoic and, Russian happiness in a certain type of man is a type of misery, perhaps. He was very, very... I remember we used to have these conversations in broken Russian where I would... he would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I'd be, well, I want to be a journalist, but I'm very worried about the future of the industry and about, the potential for Gumtree and other online classifieds to erode the traditional revenue base of the print broadsheets. And so I really don't know if it's something I can break into. And he was like, I also wanted to be a journalist, but then I was in wars for 30 years. So it helps you put things in perspective.
What age were you then when you would have said that to him?
We would have been 18, 19.
Right.
But when I was about 20, we were travelling around the world, me and the girlfriend, and we got close to... We'd gone all through South America. We'd been travelling for a long time. And then right around the time... We were planning to go to Europe, but we had run out of money. And around the same time back in Melbourne, they'd finally been given their reparations. So they just got this packet of money. So they gave it to us.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, they were like, we'll lend you this money. You're young. You'll never get a chance to do this again.
Wow.
Take this. So they lent us, a couple of $1,000s, which let us, see Europe for the first time. And, we went to Berlin, of course, because Berlin at that time was the coolest city in the world. So we were hanging out there, but at the same time, again, the Catholic guilt kicked in. And I very much wanted to... I've been given this chance to visit because of the largesse of these people who had suffered.
Being treated terribly by the Germans.
Yeah. And, there we were pumping the money back into the German economy, although Berlin is arguably hasn't been a German city for some time.
I think that says a lot about you and your character, for you to have that awareness in the moment. Like, you're travelling with your girlfriend, you're young, this is great. Oh, wait, I'm here because this family lent me money and their past is terrible.
A key trait in my character is I'll never enjoy anything.
Are you sure you're not Russian?
There has been an influence, I think. I think it's the language. You learn to speak a little bit of it and then it feeds back into, eats away at the back of your soul like syphilis. So I went to all the museums and I saw the camps and we did all the kind of the pilgrimage that people do.
I've not done that. Can you kind of give a sense of the mood of what that's like?
Well, it's very somber. It's very there's a great deal of this is the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. There's also hundreds of historical sites through the city where various atrocities took place or are memorialized, mass graves, and all throughout the rest of Europe. It's a thing that was instrumental in shaping the character of nearly every major European city, and wiped hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny European towns off the map. They're just gone. They'll never come back. So there's a sense of, I guess, of education, of learning. But it's also, in a strange way, there's a strange tourist industry that's sprung up around it, which I think is important. One of the key tenets of the Holocaust is to never forget it. To forget is to risk it happening again. So I'm glad it exists, but it's also it's a very peculiar thing to do on holiday. I met a lot of I was in Krakow on my recent jaunt to Europe. I went there for a little under a week just to see Auschwitz and talk to some people and meet some survivors. And there's a very pronounced industry there. There's Like, there's minibuses that leave every 10 minutes to Auschwitz. There's these weird little tourist buggies that you can jump on and go and see, you know, the site of this massacre, this mass grave, Schindler's enamel factory, you know, and then they drop you off at a bagel store.
Is there any joy or humour in this world, or is it purely sombre and, I don't know, it just seems like you're right, like it's tourist industry around one of the most terrible things that has happened in human history, and yet these people are all part of that industry that services people like yourself who want to travel across the world and see it for themselves.
Well, it's definitely not a party, although Krakow is a big party town. I saw a lot of people go there and they have quite a depressing day and then go out and get buck wild during the evening, which I guess is a reaction to the trauma of seeing those things. At the same time, there were those kids, like, two groups of young Americans, most predominantly, you know, taking selfies at the gate and that kind of thing, which, you know, some people take offense to, but I suppose if that's part of your cultural expression, if you're like a young person and you've grown up with selfies, which is something that baffles me, but no matter, then maybe that's just your way of interacting with these things. So that's a little off the topic.
And it's also a way of saying, again, going back to the never forget thing. Like, if you take a selfie of yourself in front of the Auschwitz gates, like, there's physical proof that you were there, and therefore it's part of the not forgetting.
That's true. You know, and, you know, while I wouldn't throw up the bunny ears in that selfie myself, if I was of a different generation, perhaps I would. So yeah, it's not very jolly or somber, but it's kind of hard to wring much humour out of these things. Yeah. Although there's a huge diaspora of Jewish writers and comics who have achieved the most phenomenal black humour from the events and from the legacy of it. You know, I think as a writer, this is a long bow to draw, but as a writer, my preferred mode is a kind of black comedy. And that is a very New York thing, which in turn makes it a very Jewish thing. Like, one of my favourite writers is David Sedaris, who's Greek, but his sense of humour is like, it comes from the Wisniks of like the 20s and the 30s, you know, who, you know, made their way up from there. Same with, you know, David Rakoff, who is a hero of mine, but he was Jewish, you know, so he's got a little more legitimacy to write about these things than I might. Forgive me, I've forgotten what the question was.
Berlin is where the seed of the idea sprung from. At what point did you start thinking, well, you were toying with the idea of being a writer at that time, and what about Berlin or about your experiences attending those kind of places struck you as something that you could tell?
The idea of a man living with unimaginable horror, that kind of just came from, I would often wonder what my these men I knew back in Melbourne, men and women, had experienced, you know, and they didn't talk about it very much. But the things they'd seen, the things they'd done to survive, you know, what else was in there? The idea, what sort of secrets did they hold? That kind of fascinated me, and I was also very. On the same trip, I went to Argentina, and I wasn't really aware of just how up with Nazis Argentina used to be. You know, a lot of the leading Nazis just escaped there and lived quite happily ever after.
All right.
For a long time afterwards, until, like, in later decades, Israeli commandos started, you know, tracking them down and forcibly repatriating them to The Hague, which is, you know, there's a lot of fine literature on all that already. One of whom was Mengele, who's a character in this book. And just the idea that this man who'd been instrumental in what I think to me personally, is one of the most visceral horrors of the Holocaust. The experimentation of the inhumane experimentation on civilians and children for his own bizarre ends. That someone could do that and then escape justice. And he did for many, many years. He was finally, I think, assassinated or captured. I don't actually know how it ended, but for many years he was just a family doctor living in like a suburb in Argentina. So that was part of the inspiration as well. And somewhere deep in the subtext, I wondered how easy it would be for someone who'd collaborated on that level with the Nazis to escape to Australia, because Australia is a very good place to forget. There's something fundamentally missing in our sense of introspection on a national level. There's a trauma that we are unwilling to look at. I met this Spanish writer the other day at Byron Festival, Victor Diablo, and we were kind of trying to talk in Spanish, and my Spanish is no better than my Russian. But he asked me what the Australian national trauma was. It's a very interesting question. I thought about it for a while, and I don't even remember what I said to him now, but I think the trauma is something so profoundly horrifying that we're unwilling to look at it, which is the fact that all Australians who subscribe to this Western culture are beneficiaries of genocide, which doesn't seem like a controversial statement to me. That's just history, right?
Yeah.
That's how colonies form. But the fact that the debate continues, I think, speaks to a blindness in our culture.
Perhaps a willful blindness.
I think very much so. Very much willful blindness, because to retcon that history would be to revisit our image as kind of, a happy-go-lucky, knockabout, resilient culture, which I think is quite far from the truth. There's a section in the Toymaker where Arkady Kulikov is teasing Tess, another main character, about her Australianness, and he says you people have a Catholic heart and a Protestant head, and that's why you don't know who you are. That's, I think, true. By that I mean we consider ourselves woe-begotten at times, but also industrious and thrifty. Two stereotypes that apply equally to those Christian cultural traditions. But what goes unsaid is that we have a black past. That in the full impact of the clumsy wordplay involved, we have a culture that still exists, that we and by we I mean gubbers and white Australians did our best to eradicate in acts of willful genocide. And that's how the world worked back then. Maybe that's how the world worked in the 1940s. It shouldn't work like that. So all those dots joined in my head, and the end result was, I guess, the narrative structure we see here, and the story I wanted to explore. That was kind of the basic idea, is that twist. I don't think it's giving anything away to say that there are some surprising turns in this narrative, but that's that idea and how to explore it. By the time I came back from Europe, that was kind of already in the back of my mind, but I didn't have the deeper knowledge of both of history and of human nature to even come close to doing it justice. Who knows if I have it now, but I wanted very much to try it. I felt like the time was right.
Did you have the book contract in hand when you were in Prague? Or was it still a prospective project at that point?
I don't believe so. I should have an answer to that. No, I don't. I did not have the contract in hand.
So they were taking a risk on the shitbag.
Yeah, definitely. I'd had some modest success with my first book, and so Penguin were my publishers. I think they would have been willing to entertain the idea of another book.
Well, they would have right of first refusal.
Yes,
presumably.
They have all the rights. They have Troy de Seigneur on me. Like, they can just come into my cottage and take whatever they want anytime. And I love the arrangement. If they're listening.
Sounds like the Gestapo.
Well, they have reach. They no, but my publishers are great. But it was a huge risk. It was a risk for UNESCO to send me over there. It was a risk for me to try to do it because I had no idea if I could. But then I did it anyway, and I think that's what you have to do sometimes. You have to take those stupid leaps of faith. And then they contracted me on the proviso that I fixed it mightily.
Oh.
Yeah, but that's kind of my process. I think I cut out a good 50,000 words of this before we got close to what the public are reading now.
Oh, right.
There were all sorts of threads and subplots that I had to abandon just because they weren't panning out. And also I was trying to do too much. I am very glad I did now because it's very busy. It's very tight.
Yeah, like you had trouble describing it in simple terms when we first began speaking, and I would also struggle to summarize it. It kind of combines modern Australia with things that happened decades ago and draws the link between those two things through a couple of particularly engaging characters.
Yes, none of whom are particularly likable.
That's right.
It occurred to me when I read it back, when it was too late to send it back to the printers, that I'd picked a fight with everything. Like, I picked a fight with many, many aspects of Australian identity and humanity as a whole. It's quite a pugilistic work, I think. Most of all with myself. It's an identity crisis writ large across a multitude of really awful people. None of whom it would occur to them that they are awful. That's kind of... If I was going to summarize the book, it's a story of bad people who are convinced they are doing the right thing.
And the tagline in the back is, a person is defined by the secrets they keep. And there are many secrets in this book.
There are.
There is a big twist, which we won't spoil here, but I just want to ask you how you went about writing that, and at what point in the process did that twist become apparent, if we can talk about it without the specifics.
Well, the twist became apparent way back like a decade ago. It's just, I knew that, I was like, that's a great twist. And every few years I've flirted with the idea of exploring that, but I would, like, a couple of times I would bounce it off friends. I was like, what do you think of this idea? And they're like, great idea, you can't do it. You know, it's too, it's not your business, Troy.
Oh.
I was like, maybe it's not. But again, later on, it was time.
Do you think you had grown in confidence as a writer to be able to tackle it?
Hopefully you never grow too much in confidence in a writer. A certain amount of self-doubt is a wonderful tool. I'd grown in ability, and I'd grown in empathy. You know, I'd learned how to... Well, I had hoped I'd learned to look beyond my immediate selfish concerns about the danger with writing a book like this is using someone else's experience to advance an agenda of your own. which I think is antithetical to good writing. I think good writing tries to understand and articulate someone else's experience through whatever kind of viewpoint you've crystallized through your own, to create a synthesis of whatever lessons there are to be learned, and then try and communicate that to a reading public. I think that's the quest. But like all heroes' journeys, that has its ups and its downs, and you end up where you started, changed for the better or worse. A little Joseph Campbell there for you.
Did you enjoy writing fiction more than non-fiction, or are they comparable for you?
I'm probably going to get sued less for this one, which is a relaxing thought.
Oh, really? Multiple lawsuits in the first book?
There were some threats.
Oh, okay.
It's, this is, my first book was a memoir about crime, so in which I admit to being complicit in all sorts of nefarious deeds. So that was always going to be a little bit dicey. So it's not a particularly relaxing experience to write that. I enjoyed writing it because that book is very much a product of my personality. I guess it's very much an act of diarizing almost. Although I've done my best to make a compelling story and explore themes, and it's a book about tragedy and loss and overcoming a family unit falling apart in the wake of a tragedy and trying to rebuild itself. Plus, addiction and crime and, STDs and all the wonderful adventures along the way. But it is from my own perspective. So I had right of reply on everything. It was just what I was talking about, things which I had inalienable knowledge of. There's no expert in your own life like you. So it was hard for me to go wrong there. Writing fiction is a whole different experience, and I love it for a bunch of reasons. It allows you to work on a wider canvas. It allows you to explore more themes than your own subjectivity might allow you to. It allows you to explore points of view which you might not agree with, which is important. I think particularly in a book like this, which is about monsters. And on an aesthetic level, it allows you to use language in a way which is somewhat more beautiful. I allowed myself some flourishes, some moments of floral diatribe in this one.
Purple prose?
Well, mauve.
Purple like the dairy milk chocolate sitting on the desk in front of you.
Yes.
Which you're eyeing off hungrily. Like
the purple snack. I don't know what fruit it's supposed to be emulating. The Cadbury Dairy Milk snack. If Cadbury would like to sponsor me to spruik their snack product, that would be very kind of them. It allows me to, I write when I'm writing non-fiction, when I'm not doing the basest, simplest journalism, when I believe it's a courtesy to remove your personality as much as possible.
Courtesy. That's interesting way of putting it. I think you're right.
When I'm doing non-fiction, narrative non-fiction, I have the voice is mine. It's very constrained. It's very dry. It's very it can be laconic. It's very sarcastic, and I don't think sarcasm would have done the justice to the countless victims of the Shoah that I was aiming for in this book if I'd gone in with my usual guns blazing. I had to develop a new skill set to come at even close to handling it with the delicacy that I wanted to try to.
How did you do that? Who were your sounding boards during that process?
Sounding boards. I read everything I could. I think that's the first point starting, particularly when you're writing a novel which is somewhat historical. I read every book I could find, saw every movie, listened to the songs of the day, just tried to transport myself into the events and the aftermath as much as possible. As far as the sounding board went, I was racked by guilt the whole way through, and I developed this obnoxious habit at parties of getting far too drunk and like tracking down the Jews.
Oh, really?
And like kind of just like tugging on their sleeve and like, so I'm writing this thing, can you absolve me? And they're like, no, just go away.
We're here to dance, man.
And then, but chiefly to try and get some of the character notes down. And I talked to survivors. I talked to people who'd actually been there, and they were the ones who seemed the most supportive of the idea. One gentleman in particular, a guy called Mitek Silva, who's a Polish guy, lived in Melbourne. He passed away recently. He was, a lot of what he said about the Holocaust and like what we can possibly learn from it. There is no real lesson there, except that it must never happen again. A lot of scholars of the Holocaust believe that it can't be understood, that there was an act of almost demonic cruelty, that it had no reason and no purpose, and it can't ever be comprehended by the human mind. I don't disagree with that. I think that it is something of such vastness that when you try to think about it as a human being, your mind kind of dislocates like a snake's jaw. You can get your thoughts around it, but it's just going to spend the rest of your life just inching through you, and maybe you'll understand a few things of it, but as a whole it is incomprehensible. But I still think we have a duty to try. In addition to kvetching about the genocide on which we're founded, I'm increasingly alarmed by the populist turns society's taking. The fact that governments can rely on a bounce in the polls in key electorates through monopolizing cruelty, which has been burnished into a currency. Cruelty against refugees. It's not a uniquely Australian problem. When I was in Europe writing this thing, and in India as well, both of those continents were drifting further to the right every day, and people were shouting for closed borders and, to abandon. It was right in the middle of the Syrian refugee crisis when I was in Europe, and the world was ready to turn its back on Syria because they were scared. And it's worth, I think, when you're trying to understand the age you live in, there's usually a lesson in history not that far down the road to look at. And people, the Western powers knew what was happening. There's evidence, strong evidence, to suggest that high levels of government knew about the ethnic cleansing that was being undertaken by the Third Reich, but didn't act on it because it wasn't their problem. There are documents that point to train loads, particularly from Hungary, had more warning than most countries, and they didn't save nearly as many as they could have because it was a Jewish problem, not a people problem. It's worth remembering that the United States of America turned down Anne Frank's application for asylum before the war, and it was only after her diary was found that her story was rendered for history. These are all things we should keep in mind today. Particularly, I don't know, there's this... One of my favourite writers about this whole thing is Hannah Arendt. She was the New Yorker journalist who covered Eichmann's trials. Eichmann, who was the architect of the Holocaust, really. And she was struck by his... how boring he was. He'd escaped for a while, Israel had brought him back, and he was on trial for the murder of 6 million people. And he just didn't understand it. His job was to make the trains run on time. And he did it. He was very proud of the job he did. The fact that those trains delivered people to their deaths had nothing to do with him in his mind. He was just a talented logician at this point in history. And she coined that famous phrase, the banality of evil, right? She's got to quote something like Eichmann it was sheer thoughtlessness that predisposed him to become one of history's greatest murderers. That's it's a trite line, but it's horrifying, particularly when you think about how thoughtlessness can be a cunning political tool, even in an ostensibly enlightened democracy such as ours. I don't want to be overly political on a show about craft and writing, but you don't have to look very hard to find some truly banal motherfuckers in the leadership. So all these thoughts were swirling through my head, and which I could only really approach through fiction. If I tried to come at it through non-fiction, I don't quite have those chops. Perhaps these things I was trying to articulate could be done in non-fiction by someone, with a writer with the eloquence. I'll leave that to Stan Grant and Helen Garner to duke it out between them. I'm sure they can work it out.
In the acknowledgements, you also thank Werner Pieper, whose recollections and insights into the Third Reich were invaluable. A relative of yours, I take it?
Possibly.
Oh.
This is a story you might appreciate. After my first book came out, I got a review in the Frankfurt Allgemeine, which is one of the big dailies over there. And then this gentleman wrote me. He's like, "Hi, my name is Werner Pieper. I am Germany's biggest LSD dealer. Do you think we're related?" And I was like...
That's a great email to receive.
I know, right? So I looked him up, and, he's that. He's a famous countercultural figure over there. He has, long grey dreadlocks, and he lives in an old blacksmith's cottage out in the country all alone. He's very fond of hash still. And he was an LSD evangelist all through the 60s. He was Timothy Leary's bootlegger. He ran with all those guys. He came to this whole lifestyle through... He'd grown up kind of the child of unrepentant Nazis after the war. After the Reich fell, they retreated down south, and they opened a boarding house for miners, and they would sing patriotic songs, and they were just waiting for the rise of the Nazi state again. And when he was a boy, when he started to comprehend what it was about, he decided he didn't want to be a Nazi child. He didn't want to live in this weird drunken Nazi hellhouse, and he ran away and lived in the forest for a couple of years.
Wow.
And then he still only ever sleeps outside.
Wow. Have you met this guy?
Yeah, he told me. Yeah, so I went to visit him when I was in Europe, and he told me all this stuff. I stayed with him for a couple of days.
In the forest?
In the forest.
Really?
He slept outside. I didn't. And then, like, he ran away to England, and he became a cook, and then he found out about LSD. By now the 60s were happening. And he got the formula and took it back to Heidelberg, where the university there started producing it. And then he made a fortune selling LSD to the Marines that were being cycled in and out of Vietnam. And then he used that fortune to found a publishing house, and he's published, I think, something like 400 books.
He personally?
No, he's only written like 100 of them. But
wow.
He publishes a lot of, like, all the countercultural manuals, and whenever they need someone to quote on, like, medical marijuana or whatever, he'll wheel them out. But his two missions in life have been to apologise for the Reich and try and fight fascism wherever he can find it, and to evangelise for the joys of LSD as a healing tool. He honestly believes that that's the way to heal the wounds left in Europe, is just turn everyone onto LSD. Fun side note, he was a drug dealer in London for a long time, and where they used to call him Pieper, because Pieper is a German name and it's hard to pronounce. And he claims that the Pink Floyd album Pieper at the Gates of Dawn is named after his LSD. I was like, yeah, alright, old man, because he's Pieper and you got to take what they say with a grain of salt. But then he was like, no, wait, and he went and got me his signed LP that was like signed by all the Pink Floyd with "Dear Pieper, thanks for everything."
Wow.
So who knows? So
maybe he signed it himself in the depths of a LSD binge.
It's very possible. It's very possible. But yeah, he was also, like, I went to visit him just because, you know, you don't pass up a chance like that to, you know, there's that Kurt Vonnegut quote, "Unexpected travel invitations are dancing lessons from God." And that's quite the dancing invitation. So yeah, I went, but he kind of helped me, you know, he was very open with it, you know, like this, what it was like to be a child of Nazis, to be indoctrinated into that, into be, you know, the shame that followed it, the regret that settled over the nation, and worse, the recriminations against being made to feel guilty for it, you know, the multitudinous kind of angst that settled over the country and the people who'd been involved from the perpetrator's side. You know, he was too young to be a soldier or anything like that, but he was still part of that culture, and without his help I would have missed out on a lot of stuff I needed to know to try and come close to understanding that.
Are you going to write about this guy?
I think so.
I think you need to.
Yeah.
He must be getting on now. How old is he?
He's like 96, I think.
What are you doing? This should be the story.
I know.
You're working on right
I
now.
know this should be the story, but like I asked him, like, have you ever written a memoir? And he's like, no, I'm a drug dealer. Like, that would be crazy. But yeah, I hope to go back to Europe and spend more time with him soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. He wrote to me and asked if he could translate Feel Good Hit of the Year. But, you know, like I said, all my rights belong to someone else. And, you know, he generally signs contracts on a handshake and a tab of acid taken in next to his fire pit in the woods. So I don't know if I can convince my long-suffering publishers to agree to those terms. But I would like to write about him, if I may.
I have not read your first book, Feel Good Hit of the Year. I've read the two that followed, which are on the desk between us. So you've had 3 books in 3 years. What the hell, man? That's incredible.
You know, it's that fear. It's you know, I write a lot. Like I don't know. I suppose I have a work ethic.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Now, but I don't know where it came from, because for a long time I was very lazy. Like a shitbag. It's well documented in my memoir. I wish...
What changed then?
I don't know.
You got a taste of success and you're like, I want more of that.
Yeah, but just enough to, like, keep me very hungry. I was having dinner a couple of nights ago with, you know, the proper authors, you know, like
What, the ones who have written more than 3 books?
yeah. Well, you know, like many of my heroes, like Tom Keneally was there, Anafunda was there. You know, these giants, literary giants, very intimidating. So I got very drunk and asinine as a response. But yeah, I don't know if like some miracle happened and I wrote a book of that magnitude, I don't know whether I would still have that hunger, you know, because then you can just kind of retire to your island and drink vodka out of a coconut forever. But perhaps I would. I think like my drive comes from I touched on this earlier, watching the Hindu dancers. They work so hard all day to become good at this one thing, which no one will ever appreciate as much as they will. People will enjoy it. It will bring entertainment or maybe even religious catharsis to a handful of the people who watch them. It's enjoyment to all. It's great to watch. But the work that goes into it, you know, the dedication takes the satisfaction that must come of that. That will never be anyone's but theirs. And although writing doesn't have a lot of perks, the rewards are, you know, slim. You do get a chance to see people enjoy what you do. You know, that's a great reward. And you get to see if you can possibly make some sort of difference, even if only difference you want to make is entertain someone for an afternoon. You get to see that happen within your lifetime, which I think is a great reward. And I'm aware of how much time I wasted and how little time I have and how little time perhaps my readers have. I got my favourite ever fan mail the other day from just a guy who said Toymaker is my second favourite novel ever. Please write another one, but hurry because I'm 93.
Oh, wow.
Which I think is like a wonderful email to receive. So, you know, I have to hurry.
You've got at least 2 fans in their 90s.
I guess I have a demographic.
Your second book is a Penguin special. It's quite a slim volume and it's a small size book. It's like 4 essays. Came out last year. I reviewed it for The Australian. I loved it.
Thank you kindly.
I want to ask you to read the first few paragraphs of the...
I believe your quote is on the cover of the Toymaker, now that I think about it.
On the back cover, yes, under the name Weekend Australian.
Of course.
The institute
As you were known on the weekends, I'm the Weekend Australian.
Indeed.
Thank you kindly.
Could you just read the first few paragraphs of this story ending on that page?
Yes, sir.
From Mistakes Were Made.
Okay, this is the first essay from Mistakes Were Made, Catching the Spirit. I'm in Nimbin, chasing a story, and I don't like the way the turkey is looking at me. The second I arrived at the hostel, set on an abandoned farm at the edge of the rainforest, the turkey started stalking me with the slow malevolence of a traffic cop. Every day, all day, every time I look at it, it folds out its plumage like a switchblade and runs a feint at me. The turkey is trying to establish dominance. The turkey does not know how badly it has underestimated me. I'm here in Nimbin covering a story for an important and influential magazine that truly I have no business writing for. The commission for the very important magazine will pay more than I usually make in a year and establish me as a proper grown-up writer. Being here on magazine business means that I am fit to burst with hubris. This puffed-up, pugilistic turkey could be my spirit animal.
What's my next question going to be?
Who is the magazine?
Yeah. Are you going to tell me?
I probably shouldn't, but they are a current affairs news magazine.
Australian? American?
Oh, no, they are Australian. Yes, but not the Australian. Not the Weekend Australian. But a news magazine that pays very well and is very well respected. And they'd hired me to write a piece in the wake of my first book, which was about being a drug dealer, about the drug culture and kind of its ramifications. And the piece ended up getting spiked, which often happens.
Why? The story is great, but just kind of cut to what happened when you were spending time in Nimbin and why the story got spiked?
Oh, yes. Well, as the story continues, I got very into it. That old work ethic kicked in, and I became quite out of sorts and quite weird, and I overwrote the piece. It was meant to be 5,000 words. I think I ended up filing something like 22,000. And so they spiked the piece, and I was bereft. Turns out that I'd had a tick in my brain the whole way through, because Nimbin is a hippie town, and I shouldn't have hugged this pony that I saw there. Yeah, I don't know, maybe that brain tick gave me my ethic. Now that I think about it, all my ethics. That would explain the blood sucking.
Why the hell did you file 22,000 words?
I just said, like, they seemed, I was out of sorts, and also it seemed like I couldn't possibly lose those words. Like, the story was so big, the one I was going for, that I was like, it'll just be easier for them to just file 22,000 words and give me the magazine than for me to cut out a single word of this gold. But then I was slightly brain damaged at the time. In the end, there was a happy ending. Meanjin ended up buying, I think, 15,000 of those 20,000 words and putting it out as like a standalone publication called Up on the White Elephant.
I'm not aware of this, so I will have to check it out.
It's all online now if you just Google it.
Fantastic.
It's so it's kind of like, it's a long investigative piece about Nimbin and about the laws around drugs and better options for treatment to prevent recidivism and addiction. Looks at Portugal and their laws, looks at other examples around the world. So I stand by my 22,000 words of gibberish. Turns out it only needed 15. But since then, I've had the tick removed from my brain, and I've learned to stick to word counts a little more efficaciously.
That intro is great because it kind of reflects the confidence that comes from having an assignment from a very important magazine as a freelancer. Like, you're probably walking around with your chest puffed out and like your little press card saying, "I'm here from X magazine and I'm here to do a very good job for a very important institution." Is that the case?
Very much so. I think I was in the first... We touched on success earlier. I'd had almost a taste of success. I'd been on... when my first book came out, there was a strong media reaction. I got a lot of press. I was on the television, I was on all the radios, and, you go quite mad the first time that happens to you. You become quite grandiose. And then it's, it leaves. And I think this is a trauma common to all debut authors. But, it's rather like being at a party and not realizing it's time to go home. That everyone else is slowly filed out around you. I believe that I was convinced that I had a sense of mission at the time. I believed that I could change the law. I believe that if people could just understand, all the conservative, reactionary elements of society who see drugs as like a moral failing rather than a complex political, economic and medical issue, which is my understanding of it. If I could just articulate that, then immediately the world would change. I believe you've also harbored similar delusions in your career.
Sure.
So I thought that the world was ready for the truth. The thing is, the truth is subjective and ultimately immaterial in a very fast news cycle. So I didn't manage to change the world, but I did manage to get a nice Nimbin holiday out of it.
What was the feeling like when you got that email back from the editor saying, you know what, Liam, we're not going to run this?
Well, it's disappointing, and it always is, and will be next time that happens.
Were you embarrassed?
Yes. Well, yes. I was not embarrassed because I always have a baseline of embarrassment. That's just kind of how I operate. But I was very, I was crushed because the idea that all my dreams hadn't come true, that I was still fallible, that definitely plays into it.
That's when you realise you're the only one left at the party,
yeah.
And this guy thinks you're not very good right now.
Yeah. Can we call you a taxi, Liam? That was that moment. But
right.
That still exists. Like, I was asked the other day to write a 1,000-word think piece, basically, on revolution. That was the broad theme. And at the time, I'd just discovered the Hamilton musical, which is the Lin-Manuel Miranda's epic hip opera about the first Treasury Secretary of the United States of America. It's a high concept album for weirdos. It's amazing. And for anyone who's a fan of classic hip hop, there's a lot of treats to be found in it. So I wrote 1,000 words about Hamilton and filed it, and they got back and they're like, it's great, we love it. Just a thing, we're not sure about the Hamilton stuff. Could you cut all that out? Without the Hamilton stuff, it's about 160 words, just talking about Sheila E. So that still happens, and it's still crushing. But I've learned to be less of a diva. A friend of mine is an editor at a literary journal, and every time I get knocked back or given strong direction from an editor, like I'll go complain to her, these fucking barbarian peasant folk just don't understand me. She's like, you're a copy boy, like a monkey could do what you do, although if a monkey was forced to work under these conditions, probably someone would rescue it. Like, just it's your job, you're there to produce copy. It's a privilege. You shouldn't be complaining about being asked to do your job well.
Yeah, they're there to improve your work and make it as readable as possible for the biggest audience possible.
Yeah.
But yeah, kill fees or stories being spiked can and do have a huge effect on the writerly ego. I was thinking about this recently myself. I had my first feature story for Rolling Stone commissioned in 2010, I think. It was like a 2,000-word story on Facebook online trolls and some people who had set up a Facebook group to torment a mother who had recently lost her child. And I was like thinking I was the greatest in the world, and I went out and reported the story and filed it, and the editor's like, yeah, this is no good. And they tried to work back and forth with me, but I didn't want to shift the original copy too far from where it was. I wasn't willing to accept feedback, and all that ego bullshit was feeding into it, and they eventually killed it. And I was like shockingly embarrassed, and I probably didn't tell anyone besides my partner for years. Whereas now it's just like, who gives a fuck? Like, it's a funny story, and it's a part of a stepping stone into the things that I did later.
It's an important part of becoming better, is learning where your faults are and how to reson over them. I work as a as the content director for a website for emerging writers. It's called Writer's Block, which I recommend any aspiring writers check out. There's a lot of resources on it.
BLOC, right?
Yes.
Writer's Block.
That's a pun, which is a tool we use as writers.
A literary device.
Mm-hmm. And that's always the first hurdle when trying to help a young writer to find their voice, is helping them understand when a device they're using or a path they're taking is not necessarily the one for them. I have a personal, probably futile war against alt-lit at the moment. Many, it's a terrible resurgence of the Kerouac syndrome, where people are writing lists instead of stories, which I'm determined to stamp out. But we'll see. They will probably win. There's more of them than me.
Yeah, you're just one man. Coming towards the end, the second essay, Mistakes Were Made, concerns what we touched on earlier, fame, and getting a bit puffed up by the media reaction and so forth. Can you talk a bit about how the first story around your debut book, Feel Good Hit of the Year, kind of established the story around you, and from that point it was hard to shake that?
Well, yes, I should have been better at doing media, because I'd worked as a journalist for years before Feel Good Hit, but
being asked questions is so much harder than asking them.
That's true.
As you're
as I'm learning right now. The media reaction, well, it was actually not... I've seen worse, eviscerations. The first shot from the publicity campaign was an extract from my book. It had been heavily edited, but it was my words.
It was in Good Weekend?
Yes.
Magazine?
Yes. And syndicated across all of the Fairfax press, so it was very popularly read that weekend. But it was me in my own words, which is all you can really ask for.
And
but
what did the extract consist of?
It was a scene of me getting arrested when I was about 18. It's vaguely comedic. That's the intent of the piece.
The black humour you discussed earlier.
But of course, when the copy is shopped out across a huge media syndicate, then every subby has about 20 seconds to look at the copy and give it a headline. Yeah. So all the headlines was often like, "Where's the dope, mum?" or like, "Sleazy drug dealer gives 10 tips on how to get arrested." So I already started to lose control of the story then.
You became a meme almost.
Yes.
Or your character.
Yes. Well, that's still more character development than some of the ones I've written over the years. And slowly, little by little, I got the hang of media, but by then the story had kind of gotten away from me, and it was very exposing. Not so much for me, but for the others. This is the problem with writing memoir: is no one else signs up for it. It's an act of no matter how good your intentions are, writing a true story about someone has a degree of character assassination to it, because you can only render so much of a person on a page. Not only are you curtailed by your own perspective and thoughts, which might not align with their actualized self, but if you've got 800 words in the weekend paper in which to draw a portrait of your highly loving but highly idiosyncratic family, then you're ultimately going to fall short on that, which is an act of supreme passive aggression at best. So that was difficult, and everyone has an opinion immediately, and I've gotten in the first kind of few months of the book, there were more Goodreads reviews of the book than books had sold.
Oh, right.
So people were either sharing it with people they thought would not enjoy it, or they were like reviewing it on moralistic grounds. So there was a little bit of pearl clutching perhaps around it, but I don't really mind. At the time, I wasn't so thick-skinned, and I took these things to heart. I never really considered the fact that someone might like go out of their way to form an opinion and share it about a book without ever reading it. But of course they will. That's people.
Yeah.
You know? My one regret from that whole era now is from when I was a rock critic and the amount of eviscerating reviews I gave to records I should have listened to more times before shitting all over them. I have a greater respect for other people's work now, which I think is a fine lesson to learn from the whole thing.
What have you learned this time around then in the promotion of The Toymaker, which is a work of fiction? It's not based on your life. It's not, connected to your family relationships and that kind of thing. Is it easier to talk about this without, potentially wounding any aspects of your personal life?
My personal life is not something I'm worried about mortgaging this time, mainly because I lost all my friends and family the first time around. So now it's
Except
just...
for Werner, who may be a long lost relative.
Except for Werner. It's very bleak, so I'm worried. I think people are more worried about me than I am of them. It is a book that could be a cry for help. We'll find out. But I'm more scared of that I got anything wrong, that I was in any way disrespectful to the dead and the survivors. I did everything I could to be sensitive. I tried to stay away from sensationalism or like pornographic, renditions of violence and that kind of thing. But at the same time, you can't really you can't shy away from the horror. These things happened. This is reality, and reality can sometimes be a terrifying place. And so that's something I wanted to explore. And I was also, as worried as I was about that I was trespassing on things, that I was committing some sort of act of vandalism or cultural appropriation in trying to explore these things that really have nothing to do with me beyond that I'm a human being in a world that let this happen. I was also very much driven along by actually another survivor that I spoke to, because I confided to him that I was very scared of telling a Jewish story, which is what the Holocaust is, let's face it. Although the complicity rests on Germany and the world, I guess the legacy belongs with the Jews and the diaspora, the survivors. So I told him, I confided him that I was terrified of telling this story. And he asked me whether the people who were telling me I couldn't write it were Jewish. I thought about it, and no, they're not. I said, well, fuck them then, it's not their decision. So that's something I keep on a little post-it note, just if I could, fuck it then. Sometimes you just have to follow your hunches.
Yeah. Well, you've written 3 books in 3 years. Is that right? Yes, that's what I said earlier. You've written 3 books in 3 years, and you've proved yourself adept at non-fiction and fiction. What do you want to do next?
I want to have a nap one of these days. I could use that. But first, I have another project in mind. But I'm actually not sure if it's going to be fiction or non-fiction. If it is fiction, it'll be very close to the events of something that happened. If it's non-fiction, I may have to lie a lot. That's a very vague answer, but
that's cool.
I've also been hanging out with a lot of older Eastern Europeans for a long time now, and I've picked up all sorts of superstitions. So I don't want to jinx it too soon.
Sure, no problem.
But I'll be the first to let you know if it ever eventuates.
Cool. Thanks for talking to me, Liam.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening, and thank you to my guest, Liam Pieper. You can find show notes to this episode and all previous episodes at penmanshippodcast.com. You can find the show on Twitter at penmanshipau and on Facebook. If you enjoy this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to be listening to this audio. You can share it with people in your life who love reading and listening to people talk about great Australian writing. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email me, andrew@penmanshippodcast.com. The theme song is Eternally Yours by Laughing Clowns. That's it for now. Until next time.